So this is kind of a unifying theory. I'm trying to unify psychological theories together. So I'm pulling from a bunch of different things. It's heavily based in neurology. And so I'm going to try to establish here the proper way to treat mental health as opposed to how we do it. We're kind of like a symptom management in the United States. We use a lot of cognitive approaches, which have their uses for short-term treatments. But ultimately, we can actually heal a lot of things that we don't have to manage, or that we usually just try to manage. It's like going to the doctor and they're like, hey, your arm's broken. And you're like, yeah, can you help me deal with healing it? And they're like, oh, let's just learn how to use your other arm instead. That's kind of like our mental health system. But so what I'm going to try to do here right now is I'm going to ask you a couple questions, and I just want you guys to say whatever comes to mind. All right? So imagine you're walking in the desert and you drop an apple, and the apple seed lands. What's wrong with that story already? Apple tree, seed in the desert.
There's no water.
Not any water. But let's say that it rains. So on this day it rains, and for the next couple weeks it's just raining. You know, it's like, hey, cool, it's raining in the desert. So it germinates. You know, it gets a little bit of roots, but the desert doesn't have a lot of nutrients. So you know, the tree grows, but it's a little more brittle than usual. It doesn't really have everything it needs to develop the right kind of trunk. So it gets its branches out like that. And what's a tree supposed to do? Like, what's an apple tree supposed to do? Grow apples. So, you know, it can grow a few apples because there's something in the soil or the sand. Grow a couple apples. Now, this tree, its life experience is what? Like, how would you describe this tree's life experience so far?
Deprived of nutrients.
Okay. So, if you didn't have everything that you need growing up, what would that experience be if you were to put it in like a word?
Poor.
Okay. Lacking. We'll say lacking.
Deprived of something.
Lack. Okay. Would we say that it's struggling? Struggle? Okay, struggle. So put struggling. Now this tree, what is it trying to do just because it's lacking and struggling? Like, what's it trying to do? Grow. So it's trying to survive. So, you know, generally I would ask, do you guys feel like life is about survival? Is it about struggle? Is it about those things? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. You don't feel that way? That's fine. Yeah. Okay. So you're going to get different answers. Like, it's always going to be different answers. Okay. So anyhow, now this tree is only known this environment. It's never been in a different environment. So the lens that this tree looks through is totally in the desert. But it hears about another tree that's in a temperate climate. And because there's lots of nutrients, it's got a really good root system. And it's able to provide all the nutrients to build the trunk that it needs and put foliage on this tree. And the foliage actually helps the sun not destroy it. The sun's supposed to be giving it life along with the nutrients. But in the contrast to this tree it's being beaten down all the time. So when this tree looks over at this tree, what does it feel? What does it think?
Jealous.
Okay, jealous. Put a jealous J. All right, what else?
With a goal, a desire.
Okay, so not coveting, but we'll say just a goal. We'll just put goal. Okay, all right, so now how does this tree, hypothetically in this story that doesn't really make sense because we're talking about a tree, how does this tree become like this tree? This tree is able to put tons of fruit on it.
Relocate.
Change its environment.
Changing its environment, interesting. You're actually the first group of people that have ever said that. So it needs to change its environment, but how does it do that?
By the next set of seeds. It's not possible to do it.
Okay.
Unless somebody else uproot it and move it to the environment.
Okay, now you said the next set of seeds, and I'm going to come back to that, and we're going to talk about epigenetics. So let me just put epigenetics, epi right here. All right, so this tree learns like, okay, so I want to be more like this tree. And this tree over here, or people that think that they're this tree, for sake of argument, are going to look over here and like, if you want to bear fruit like me, you got to do X, Y, Z. You got any ideas on what those X, Y, Z's might be? Like, what are you being told that you got to do in life?
Oh, you gotta take your leaves and absorb the sun.
Okay, yeah. You got to get outside. You got to get outside. You got to get a job. You got to do all these things up here in the surface that are visual. You got to check all these boxes. All of these things are performance-oriented things to show that you are like this tree bearing fruit. Okay, now I'm going to challenge that whole process here. Okay, so the first level of character development is called attachment. And this is how well your emotional needs are met in childhood. Like, do my needs matter? Do they not matter? Like, what am I going to do with my emotional needs? So if I grow up in a home where my emotional needs are basically, I'm told I'm weak. Little boy, running, falls and scrapes his knee. What does dad say in our culture?
Get up.
Get up. Man, why? Why are we saying that to our sons? Like, why are we telling them that?
Because in society, when you get older, you have to not cry.
Okay.
As a man.
So crying is weak, emotional needs are weak. Okay. So we have to perform. Another example of what are we trying to do above the surface? We're trying to perform. And to be a man, you can't have emotional needs. So the next level of character development is called integration. And integration is the ability to integrate the good and bad parts of self and the good and bad parts of others. So if my emotional needs are bad to my father, to my mother, which is where I'm developing my identity from, I don't want to be bad. So I have to bury my emotional needs, and I have to perform. So this is the first level of character development, and this is where codependency begins. Do you guys know what codependency is? Let me use a different color here.
Yeah.
All right. Let's hear it.
It's when you emotionally depend on something else or others.
Okay. And I would say generally most people would agree that it's the form of dependency. Because in our culture, we've got this idea that if we're dependent upon somebody, we're not independent, right? Would that be fair? So like if I live with somebody, they're paying all the bills, or if they're abusive and I'm enabling, we don't usually think of the abuser as also codependent, but both people are codependent. So I'm going to paint a picture here. So a codependency actually is I have learned that I cannot emotionally depend upon my parents, which is the next level of dependencies, is from codependency to dependency. But because my parents say you got to be strong, you can't be weak, I've now learned that I have to depend upon a substance or a behavior. And substance usually comes later, but first it starts out as behaviors. So a substance, that's a behavior or a substance. So now I'm going to regulate my emotions through performing or through drugs. You get what I'm saying? Through some type of substance. And they can perform both the exact same at the same time because like a gymaholic, for instance, is a workaholic. A lot of times you'll see that coupled with functional alcoholism. Like if I have to be good enough all the time and I can never be bad because I'm unlovable then I have a lot of anxiety. And anxiety might not be a diagnosis of anxiety at that point. It's more of a performance, like I have to go and I have to keep going. It's this pressure I put on myself because I hate all of the weak parts of myself that don't perform. So now because I hate that part of myself, I also don't like it when other people have those needs. I'm more likely to end up in an abusive stance, more abusive in my relationships. Now, when I say abusive, this doesn't mean I'm hitting somebody necessarily. It can, but it also can mean your emotions don't matter. You've got to be strong. I need you to perform like I have learned how to perform. The problem is that people that think they're over here, you read books about them all the time. You read, if you want to be successful, get up and you make your bed in the morning. You do these things, X, Y, Z, and da-da-da, and you got to make sure you just keep hustling and going and going and going. You just got to keep performing. And the problem with that is that there's no balance. It's all go, go, go. And in that process, you look at their relationships, these authors, these super successful people, and they've got marriage problems. They've got substance abuse problems. And they're telling you how to be successful because culture is telling you everything is about performance. Everything, as you're checking these boxes, this is what makes you healthy and successful. And as long as you're meeting this criteria, you're fine. But the flip side of this is no matter how hard I try, it's not enough. So if I grow up and my emotions they don't matter, and I'm constantly being told that they don't matter, and I go and I try to perform all of these things, and I don't get any traction from it. I go outside, I do these things. Now I've got depression. I might even have suicidal ideation now. Because no matter what I do, it's not enough. And everybody's telling me what to do, so eventually I'm just going to hide it. I'm going to fake it. I'm going to pretend, I'm going to jump through the hoops, I'm going to give lip service to the people around me, I'm going to act happy, but on the inside, I'm dead. I literally think it would be better off dead, and now I'm just staying alive for other people. I might be somewhere in between, where I'm seeking, like I feel this way, but I'm reaching out, letting people know, hoping that somebody will still say that I matter, that I'm good enough. But the problem is that this divide right here is because of this divide right here. So to develop neurologically speaking, you have to have emotional dependency. Mary Ainsworth, this is like shortly after Freud, Mary Ainsworth did this experiment called the Strange Experiment. I think I had the timeline right with what I just said, but the Strange Experiment, basically she had a bunch of babies and parents go into a room with a stranger. And so the stranger's sitting there, and you should look this video up on YouTube. The stranger's sitting there, the mother comes in with the baby, puts the baby down on the ground, and after a few minutes she gets up and walks away. And depending on how the baby acts when she leaves, depends on how healthy her attachment is, or his attachment with the parent is. Is the baby distressed that mom's gone? Is the baby not distressed? If the baby is distressed, that can be a good thing. We might not think of it that way, but it can be a good thing. So when mom comes back in, this is the second indicator. Mom comes back in, and is the baby crying? If the baby's not crying, that's a bad thing sometimes. If the baby is crying and mom picks up the baby and baby pushes away, that's telling you another thing. And instead, if the baby is just fine and soothed and then mom just puts the baby down, that's really good. So there's attachment, there's anxious avoidance, there's healthy attachment, and there's disorganized attachment. And depending on how you handle your baby before you're even developing as a human being into an adult, before you develop into a human being as an adult, you're already a human being, you have already internalized emotional trauma that you may not even remember. Because your prefrontal cortex, let's just say the outside wrinkly part of your brain, that develops after you're 3. It starts beginning at that point. That's why we don't have a lot of memories before we were 3. Before that, before you're 3, you are mostly all amygdala, your reptilian brain, your fight, flight, freeze, fold function. It's how you survive. You are pretty much entirely dependent upon another human being. We're not hatched out of eggs and left alone. We literally are born to be dependent immediately in our life. And what we were doing previous generations ago, Dr. Spock, not from Star Trek, but he basically taught this idea of self-soothing. And self-soothing is this idea that when your child cries, you let them cry themselves to sleep. And what ends up happening is the child has pre-cognitive trauma where they have learned that no one's going to come to their rescue when they're upset. Because of that, you have learning disabilities that develop. You have emotional disabilities. You have pre-cognitive traumas that you don't even understand why you feel more anxious or depressive or all these different things. And if you grow up into a home that is managing things by performance that way, then it's probably going to carry on until you're after 3. So like we talked about, you fall, you scrape your knee, you've got to be strong enough. But there's also another more insidious form of this. And it's what people say when we're told, like a little girl to her mom, she's upset and she's crying. What mom might say to her little girl? Everything's going to be okay. So what could we call that? Like, okay, so we might think of it that way, but I'm going to show you how it's not. So, okay, so basically we're recognizing there's distress and we're telling the child it's going to be okay. So we're saying your feelings, I don't know how to handle your feelings. I just learned how to manage them the way that I'm managing it. I'm telling you it's going to be okay. So the child's upset. What else what might they do or say? Console them. Okay, what might they say? So let's say we can even change it to high school. So like kids in high school and they're being bullied. What might the parent say? Fight back. Okay. Fight back. Everything's going to be okay. What about life is hard? You're going to have to learn how to deal with it. All these different things. We learn these things because we grew up in the desert. Our families grew up in the desert, and we're trying to tell our kids how to survive. Meanwhile, we're totally missing out how the brain develops neurologically, actually develops neurologically. So the amygdala, which is in the middle of the brain, this is from Daniel Siegel right here. He does this thing where he's got the right and left hemisphere, and they wrap over the amygdala. This outside part doesn't even begin to develop until, like I said, you're 3. And so the problem is the whole job of the amygdala is fight, flight, freeze, and fold. Its job is to shut down your ability to think. The moment that there's a trigger due to a big or a small trauma, it will shut down your ability to think. You're in arguments with your significant other. You're in arguments with your kids. You're feeling a certain way. You're feeling like maybe they're telling you not good enough or they're being whatever that it is that you're experiencing. They're also experiencing something internally. Their amygdala's shutting down and they're reactive. And it's like, someone who says to their significant other, hey, it hurt me when you did this. But they grew up in a home where conflict was either avoided or toxic. Their response at that point, they might be feeling they're under attack. you're criticizing me. I can never do anything right with you. But in reality, that's their childhood dynamic in their family. They're triggered, and then they become aggressive. Now they're the abuser, invalidating the person who tried to say, hey, you hurt me, like let's talk about this. And so that's the amygdala shutting it down. And two people trying to communicate with each other, there's a whole underlying aspect with the amygdala's role in the brain. So you ever been, heightened emotion, and then after you're from a heightened emotion, you think about it later, and all of a sudden you're like, wait a minute, like maybe I shouldn't have said that. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. That's because of the job of the amygdala. So, but that all goes back to attachment again. So in this process, like, okay, so I've got the attachment. Do my emotional needs matter? If they don't, then I've got to be good enough or bad enough. Or I'm all bad or I'm all good. And then the next level is separateness or differentiation or individuation is basically how I identify myself as separate from another person. But if I learned growing up that my emotions don't matter and I've got to measure up to my dad or my mom's expectations, or I'm told that I just need to bury my feelings and my feelings are invalidated, like it'll get better, I'm learning that I can't have emotional dependency. Now all of a sudden, my self-worth and my ideas of where my boundaries lie is based off of my interactions with others now. So it's going to be really hard for me to have healthy boundaries, because if I need to be good all the time and I need everyone to see me as good all the time, then I literally have to be in control of other people's opinions of me. So with narcissism, for instance, if we take it to an extreme, which everybody has some narcissism because no one grew up with perfectly healthy families, then the situation is this, is that I need to have control because I can't let my guard down. The moment I let my guard down, I might be seen. And that isn't necessarily conscious thought, but it's, I got to convince everyone around me that I'm good enough. I got to be the best. I got to do this because if I'm not, I'm all bad. It's this polarization of self-worth. And now that looks like boundaries is I need to be controlling the relationship. These people are love bombers. They come in and they try to validate somebody right off the bat. They get their attention, and then the other person's like resting in that because it feels so good. The person that kind of hangs out over here sometimes is like, oh man, it feels really good to be validated by somebody and be seen. So they hook them in. This isn't conscious. And then now they're in an abusive, codependent, enabling relationship. And that is a spectrum. So anyways, now I can't have boundaries. Then so let's say this person goes to therapy. You know what? Because the abusers usually don't go to therapy. They think they're fine. They're in control of everything. They're in control of everybody else. Everyone else does all the work. So the enabler is now over here, and they're like, oh man, I'm in a crappy relationship. I need to figure out how to have a better relationship. How can I be more like this? So they go to a therapist, and the therapist might say, we're going to do couples therapy. They might say, we're going to do individual therapy. Whatever their plan is, ultimately they're trying to get the person how to have boundaries. So this person who's the enabler goes over here, and they're like, okay, so I'm going to have boundaries with my significant other. I'm going to tell them no. I'm going to stand up for myself. The problem with that is quickly seen, because what happens when someone who hasn't been standing up for themselves, who's been nagging, trying to get their point across, because they're doing all the emotional work in the relationship, what happens when they're like finally like, okay, I'm not going to let myself experience this anymore. I'm going to separate myself. What would the abuser do in that situation? Or the person who is being told that I'm not going to tolerate this anymore? They might, but if they're in a marriage or they're really, usually what happens is the abuser becomes very aggressive initially. They get angry, they try to tell the person that they're wrong, and then the enabler is thinking, oh, how do I navigate these landmines again? How do I do this? How do I do that? To make it safe for this other person. Because their whole job, they've learned that they only performed well enough if they did all the work for their parents, their family, their whatever. So let me just bring this down here. So there's a cactus, and this is dad. And he's a middle finger in this kind of context. And then mom over here is a tumbleweed. We'll just draw over that. So mom doesn't really have any roots in this story. Dad's a cactus. He's learned that, emotional needs, they're weak. I've got to be strong. I've got to be seen as strong. I can't have any weakness. I've got to hold it all together for myself and everybody else. It can't be weak. But because of how codependency works, he ends up with a person who does all the work in the relationship emotionally. He might be working all the time physically, whatever it is, but this is an emotional piece, and they've got roots too. So this is really the important part. This is where the magic happens, because in a temperate climate, plants share all types of nutrients with each other underneath the surface. It's a mycelium, I think is the right way to say it, mycelium network or whatever, and they share nutrients. In a desert, in my story, and generally in a desert, there's not a lot of that going on. So there's not a lot of nutrients. If this tree needs, reaches out over here and is like, I need some nitrogen, this plant's going to pass it on to them. And that happens in nature. But in my story over here, this is what happened. He reaches out to dad and is like, nope, you got to be strong. So the tree doesn't have everything it needs to bear fruit. He reaches out over here to mom, and mom gives it, hey, you know what? Life is hard, or I'm sorry, it'll get better. None of that is nutrients. It's all acknowledging, hey, you know, you're alone. You're alone with your feelings. So attachment, with, like we talked about with the amygdala and the prefrontal, if my emotions are hurt and I feel seen, like if I'm crying as a baby and mom picks me up, there's a couple things happening. We've got mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are what allow you to copy what someone else is doing. Is also what allows you to feel empathy, as far as I understand. And then on top of that, you have this thing called containment. So if mom picks up the baby and baby's crying, let's say mom, you know, some parents might be like, oh my God, I'm so overwhelmed by your crying. So the mom is not able to contain the baby's crying. Or mom might overreact and be like super stressed out and be like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, and picks up the baby. That's not containment either. But if mom picks up the baby and looks, gives eye contact, physical touch, and validates the baby's stress, oh, it's cold, isn't it, honey? It's cold, isn't it, honey? That's called containment. And literally what happens, you can see lighting up in parts of the brain around the amygdala. And what we know now is it creates a network, a neural network, a bandwidth of stress resolve, of the ability to handle stress that grows out into the brain and increases your cognitive abilities and your ability to handle stress. So we all go to war together. One of us gets PTSD when we see Sidmar get blown up, and the rest of us don't. And, you know, the thing is that happens because we have different levels of connections between our amygdala and prefrontal. We have higher bandwidth for stress depending on the amount of containment we got. And that's called emotional attunement. So if the mother is validating the emotional stress of the child can now feel safe because the child is dependent upon the mom emotionally for support. But if mom doesn't provide that, the child is stuck here, right? And as we grow up in our culture, usually most parents are doing what I just described. But once we get about 3, there's this shift. Because when you get to be 3, you start to begin neurologically to differentiate yourself. You start, you know, I'm no longer you. But the problem is if we don't have that healthy development in the neurology of the brain, we're already in a coping state. So what ends up happening, this is called the Townsend model up here at the top. I should have mentioned them before. But what ends up happening is I'm dependent upon the behaviors. So now I'm kind of stuck in this process, and everybody in my family is stuck in this process. And I go to therapy, and they're telling me I need to perform. You need to listen to your spouse. Repeat back what they say, which is called reflective listening, or take this medication or whatever. And all that stuff's helpful, but we always got to go back. We always got to go back over here. So the next part here. So after I move from fear of emotional dependency to dependency, I'm now like that baby. I'm hearing the emotional needs. My parent is hearing the emotional needs, and they're being validated. The mother is not saying to the baby, you know what, let's just look positive. Let's think positive. You know what, things could always get worse. Do you guys know the difference between empathy and sympathy? Does anybody know that? Okay. Anybody want to take a stab at it?
Empathy is the ability to feel the emotions of another. Sympathy is standing on your own emotion and giving a more pity position.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good description. So people that give sympathy often feel empathy, but they don't know how to express empathy or empathetically. They themselves don't even allow themselves to have empathy. It's like when you talk about people that don't love themselves. So what they end up doing is they're giving a symptom management suggestion. It's like, and Brene Brown does this, she does this story where, you know, there's like this animal that's in a pit. And the animal's in the pit, and it's dark in there. And a giraffe comes along, and he sticks his head down in the pit, and he's like, oh man, it sucks down there. That's sympathy. Whereas the difference might be is like, let's say a rabbit comes down, he gets down into the pit, he sits next to the other animal, and he's like, man, it's dark in here. There's a key difference. You guys hear the difference there? Can you identify what the difference is, what I just said? Like, man, it's dark in here. Versus, man, it sucks down there. What is the key difference?
Being a part of it.
Yes. Empathy is feeling what another person's feeling. But if we're not communicating that we're feeling it, then the other person is alone in it. So if my emotional needs are going to matter, I need to know that I'm not alone in my feeling. But our whole culture is telling us that we're supposed to manage it. We can't be weak. We got to be strong. So we're told that never to go there. But if someone comes in and they're suicidal, for instance, no matter how you try, and they're like, I want to kill myself. I'm going through all these different feelings and shame around it, and now I'm to the point where I just don't care, and everybody's told me to do all these different things. And someone says, well, you got to go outside, get a job, go do these things, and they've heard all this stuff. How pastors in churches and then they're like, oh, you didn't have the faith, and or whatever those are, all these different things, all these external things. But they're not feeling heard, they're not feeling understood, and they're trying to cope with it. So what happens is instead, someone comes along and sits with them like, man, I feel literally like every day I'm having to choose to be here because I'm a jerk if I leave. And they're like, exactly. And I've been told I'll do all X, Y, Z. I've been told to go out and do this and do this and do this, and it doesn't work. And they're like, exactly. Now what's interesting is what's happening here is we don't want the person to take their own life, so we try to stop them, we try to invalidate their reasons for wanting to do it. But instead, if we sit with the person in it, now this can be dangerous because if you do this and you leave the person alone, you've opened up the wound that they've tried to protect. But instead, the first time ever, what's happening is the person's being heard. And that is actually the root of it. Most of the time, that is the root of it. I've never actually felt heard and seen. If my feelings matter, I matter. If my feelings don't matter, I only matter through a behavior and a substance. And that's really key. That's the key thing. So learning how to communicate empathetically changes everything. Because if I feel heard and seen, and I know that that's what it feels like to hear somebody validate my feelings, when someone doesn't do that, I'm not feeling like I have to jump through hoops anymore. I don't feel like I have to do all the work in the relationship. I don't feel like I have to have control. I've internalized the level of self-worth at that point, and that allows me to have healthy boundaries. Whereas the other person who tries to have healthy boundaries, bringing it back to that, they end up putting the boundary out there. The abuser gets angry. Then they're triggered because now they're feeling that they didn't make it safe for the abuser. So they're scared of abandonment, which we talked about that person leaving. So now all of a sudden they're like, well, what can I do to make it safe for you again? They find themselves right back in the pattern. The next step they might find themselves in is they might pull back. But the moment that the abuser now shifts from I'm all good and you're all bad, telling the enabler they're all bad, to I'm all bad. Now that feels really good to the enabler because they're saying, you know what, you're the best thing that's ever happened to me. I don't want to lose you, because they now have flipped because their all good persona and image didn't work, didn't control you. So now they flip, they're all bad, and they put you in the all good category. And that feels really good to an enabler. So they go back to the same pattern. You see this in most divorce rates, why divorce rates are usually up to, 80%, 70%, and something high like that after, first-time marriages, I think is 50 to 60, and then it just progressively goes up to three-time marriages. And so we play out this pattern, but really we don't realize how we're contributing. But anyways, then it's really hard to have healthy boundaries unless you get this whole process. Now you have healthy boundaries, and the last level is called adulthood. And adulthood is about authority. And Carl Jung calls this self-actualization. And this is your ability to respect people in power. What's up?
Could you explain kind of what you said about the good, bad, and flip once more? You kind of went a little fast, and I shouldn't really grasp that part.
The good, bad. That was a lot. So it was, which part of it? Do you have more context?
The enabler flips the roles.
Okay. So if I'm an abuser, I have to be good all the time. I have to be seen as good all the time. I have to believe that I am the right. I am good all the time. Whereas an enabler is like that as well, but they're more primary depressive versus primary anxious, where the abuser is more here, and they've got to protect their ego here. Whereas the enabler is somebody who's over here, where they're only seen good, they only feel good if they're doing all the work, they're rescuing the other person. They're trying to make sure they check all the boxes to make it safe for the abuser. Because if they make it safe for the abuser, if they make it safe for the cactus, if the tumbleweed makes it safe for the cactus won't need the pricklies anymore. And we'll see, oh my gosh, you are so loving, you are so strong, you are such a good person, I'm so lucky to have you, which is what they're chasing, and it's external validation. But they're mostly over here. Are you tracking with this or no?
Yeah.
Okay. The goal basically, we're just all functioning from this external, validation of behavior here, because where self-worth is in our performance now at this point instead of actually where it becomes. Because if my feelings matter, then I matter. Once you internalize what it feels like to feel heard from what's called empathetic attunement, now when anyone does anything else, they try to give you this idea hey, you know what? life's hard, or it'll get better, or whatever it is, that doesn't feel like support. And you recognize that. Whereas if you didn't have that internalized, you're still jumping through hoops. Are you making
I kind of got it. It was just a little part of it that you went fast. Now I can understand
Okay.
what you're saying here.
So authority, essentially, is my ability to step into authority, my ability to respect authority, my ability to self-actualize. And if this doesn't line up, like if all these boxes aren't developed properly, that's going to play out with how I react to having a boss, how I react with being a boss. Does it validate me to make me feel good to have power over other people? Or did I grow up in a situation where it could even be cultural or subcultural, where like with the police department or something like where no matter what I tried, it was never enough. So you know what? I don't trust authority. And so now I can't really trust authority's always out to get me. Or I had to line up with authority perfectly and believe that authority would never do anything bad. I have to believe that, and this plays into your politics and it plays into your faith. Speaking of politics or whatever, and this isn't how, we're super divided between a two-party system in the United States. So if I grow up in a home where my emotional needs don't matter and I can't have weaknesses, so I have to perform to be good enough, and because I can't have weaknesses because they're bad, I don't want other people to have weaknesses, so therefore, I'm more likely to be a Republican now. I'm more likely to think, you know what? Anybody who doesn't perform as well as me, it's just because they're lazy, because that tells me I'm good enough. Whereas I could be a Democrat because the whole system worked against me. And that doesn't make all Democrats either. But it could be the whole system works against me, and I never felt like I could let my guard down, so I'm going to take what I can get. I'm bad no matter what. So I might be more of a Democrat and want more handouts. And so people get these ideas of different parties, and they feel justified by the echo chamber that they're in. Like, you get a bunch of people who are more like this, listening to each other, and social media kind of perpetuates that. I don't know if you guys know what I'm talking about, but it's like, it kind of groups people's threads into exactly what they already think to validate it. And you go to churches, and it's the same thing, whatever. But ultimately, until you get this initial piece here, you can't hear what the other people are saying. You really are filtering it through your experience over here. The lenses that you're looking through, you are filtering all of what other people are saying until you listen with empathy. And empathy is just trying to understand it completely from their perspective emotionally. So anyways, that plays out with authority and power. Like, I will never feel powerless. Like, if somebody is raped, for instance, they might decide, I will never trust a man again. I will never feel powerless. Men are bad, and the men that they keep dating play into this whole dynamic right here, and it just perpetuates it because it's the same type of men. You get what I'm saying with that? Okay. So there's one other important piece of this. So like, if I'm an addict, for instance, and I've learned that behavior, and you go to AA, which I'm not knocking on AA, but AA is not an emotional support. It's all cognitive, and it's not even really done by therapists or people that are trained. So have you guys ever been to like an AA meeting or anything like that? Ever seen that? So there's certain things that they say in there and they perpetuate, and in the groups themselves, when you share, you're not getting empathy back. You're really not even allowed to crosstalk, which can be beneficial, which means you talk at the same time as somebody else, you interact with them while they're talking. But usually people share and they share stories, and that's cool to let me know that I'm not alone. But how neurons work is really key to understanding how this whole thing happens between coping mechanisms, whether they're behavior or substance. So you have a neuron, and a neuron has these squiggly things that go off the side of it, and those are called dendrites. And at the end of every dendrite, there's a synapse, and then you have another neuron, and you have another dendrite and another synapse, and this is called the synaptic gap. And what ends up happening is over time, when you keep experiencing something you keep thinking something, you keep practicing something, you get a thicker myelin sheath, and it's basically electrical insulation that goes around the dendrite, like an electrical cord. And the more that it's experienced, the faster the transmission can get because there's less interference. So then right about here, when you get to the synapse, it sends these neurotransmitters across the way here in this box. So I'm going to zoom in on that really quick, and I'm going to make this simple and explain it the best way that I can. But this is the dendrite, this is the dendrite, and this is the synapse right here, and this is the synapse now. And here's the gap. We zoomed in. And we're going to look at this. There's actually, I think, like 16 different neurotransmitters, but for sake of argument, let's say this is a PlayStation controller. I don't remember the order of things, but we got these shapes. And a healthy person has the right exact opposite side here. But let's say sadness is an X, and I'm emotionally invalidated, and I'm not measuring up. And so I don't want to feel X's anymore. So I might use something that blocks an X, neural uptake inhibitor. Or I might find something to just give me O's. I might, smoke some weed or whatever to give me O's. What ends up happening is whatever I'm sending across, the other side makes more receptors for. And now I'm an addict. So people can grow up in the same home, and they can literally, based off of their experiences with their family, they will develop different receptors. Sometimes the same, and so one person might be an addict. Birth order plays into this. Like if you're the firstborn, what's expected of you, you got to be the adult. You got to always be good to help the other kids and stuff like that, so there's more responsibility. The last kid, is enabled more. You got different things. And so one person might end up using some way, one person might be behaving some way. I might be a gymaholic, workaholic, because it sends across these triangles here. However that plays out is then now I'm an addict. And when I remove the sending, or I remove the blocking of whatever it is I'm trying to regulate and manage here, I'm in a state of possible relapse at this point. Is this making sense? You guys understand what I'm saying? So in AA, once you're an addict, you're always an addict. That's what they say. But I'm going to challenge that completely, because if over time I give time for this to change, what ends up happening, and I deal with the emotional reasoning for this, the background, the emotional reasoning for this, now I'm sending the right things across in about a year and a half, 6 months to a year and a half is what they say. This will adapt. And if I've internalized my self-worth, I'm not needing to be dependent upon a substance or behavior anymore. And I've seen these changes, pretty powerful changes. So, but anyways, the next level of this is codependency, dependency to independence, which we think of, I'm a strong, independent person, I don't need anybody. But that really doesn't mean crap, because that means you're a codependent, it means you're scared of emotional dependency, and you've got hurt so many times that you'd rather just avoid it. Does that make sense? You'd rather avoid relationships. So now I'm just going to say I don't need anybody, and I'm only going to surface level get with people. Are you tracking? Anyways, interdependency is really the last level. And that is, at this point, after I've learned my emotions matter, I've internalized really self-worth now, I know what it feels like to matter outside of performance. And when I know what it matters outside of performance, now I'm able to provide emotional support to others with empathy. And in that process of providing that, if they don't provide it, I'm not triggered. I'm not triggered anymore. This is called memory consolidation, according to Daniel Siegel. And what that looks like is, if I'm scared of being vulnerable, because I was scared of being vulnerable in my childhood, and somebody gives me empathetic attunement, I might be reluctant, but they start validating me. I'm like, yeah, that's exactly how I feel. And it brings my emotions back. You guys ever seen movies where, like, somebody's in war, they come home and they hear a firecracker? What happens? Because time doesn't exist with the amygdala. It does not exist at all. So if I'm constantly told that I have to be good enough, or I'm a piece of crap, or whatever it is that I was told in my childhood, what ends up happening is that's trauma. It's called small trauma. And the moment that I'm threatened in any way by somebody saying, hey, it hurt me when you did this, or you could have done better, my brain hijacks it. It stops my ability to think logically. And now I either have to measure up or I'm all bad. And so now I wanted to play out these whole things. And I get stuck in this pattern. I completely lost where I was going with that. But essentially how that plays into this whole thing right here is that I need to know that my feelings matter for me to be able to internalize my self-worth. And then I don't need to depend upon substance or behavior anymore. And now I can be truly, this is where I was going with it, interdependent. So like a couple comes together and one person says something that would be hurtful in the past to them. They don't hear it that way because they have now experienced a completely different environment. They know what it feels like to feel heard and seen. They're getting everything that they need. They've internalized their self-worth. They no longer need someone to validate them. And that's the main thing. This is all about external validation. I don't need external validation anymore, but now I know my self-worth. So any questions? Yeah, you got one or no? Okay.
So does the tree that grew without the resources, is it that it seen or felt what it felt like to be nourished? Or did it come to an age where it understood how it grew and internalized that as this is who I am?
Okay. So if you were to say you were upset about something, any story, anything, just make something up. Yeah, just tell me something that's negative, just briefly. Just make something up really quick.
Somebody stole our car.
Okay. Someone stole your car. All right. Make it a little more dramatic if we can. What happened?
No, that was real life. Somebody stole our car.
Okay.
We were living out of our car. We had all of our belongings in it. We were staying with friends.
Now it's more dramatic. Okay.
Like literally all of our paperwork, all of our hygiene products, all of our clothes,
Yeah.
like everything.
So my whole life is uprooted.
Gone.
Literally lose everything. We were struggling and in a tight situation, and we, like, okay, we're at rock bottom, and then now all of a sudden it's even worse now. Like, can it get worse? Like, okay, so that is different than me being like, man, that sucks. Like what I just said versus me saying, man, that sucks. Or, you know what? Life is hard. Like, we just got to get back up, right? We got to keep our chin up. Got to keep faith. Does that make you feel different than if instead I go back to what I just did a moment ago and I'm like, no, I'm losing everything. Like, I've just lost everything. Like, when I said that, you were like, yes. Like, there's a difference.
And you validated you used empathy. You validated the other person's feeling at the time. So that nourished that neuron. That's the synapses connected in that point because you
Yes.
made that connection, that emotional connection with me.
Yes. And I appreciate you getting engaged in this because this really brings me to things that I should have said. But the window that you have to receive empathy is shut most of the time because we've learned that we can't be emotionally vulnerable. So we have these ego state resistances, these walls that we put up that block us from letting other people see us vulnerably. But we still do. We still cry. We handle those things. We feel the emotions, but we don't know what it's like to actually feel empathy from another person because everyone's just like, they're giving us sympathy. So when someone starts to give us empathy, a lot of times, if you're genuine and you're really feeling whatever it is that's negative, you're more likely to be able to let it in because the window's open. You're not blocked off, right? So if you're role playing and you're not really feeling it, empathy doesn't really feel the same as if it is when you're really in this crappy state. Did that answer your question here or no?
In a sense, I was more so going off the interdependency because it seems like a lot of this is cognitive. You were saying how the more an action happens, the more the sheath, the connection, the conductor of the synapses, the cord going to the synapses
Yeah,
is
synapse.
protected. So there's less resistance. So that seems like it's an over a period of time situation. So there's growth involved in this. The tree that's bearing fruit, it got to a phase to bear. It didn't wither like some other trees would have, or some other seeds may in that same scenario because because the tree at one point said, okay, this is how much sun I can receive. This is how much fruit I can bear. And now it doesn't bother him, that tree, as much at the age because it understands its state of being, in a sense.
Okay.
Because the tree still can't get up.
Yeah, the tree can't get up, but if you go around here and you dig around the roots and you provide the right nutrition, what happens to this tree?
Oh, then it grows.
That's right. That's the difference. When you provide emotional empathy, that's what you're doing.
Okay, so the emotional empathy would be more so like a cactus empathizing with the tree you have in the network, and now they're sharing, and they empathize.
Yeah, it would be more what's going on here with the mycelium network than it would be with the cactus. But like, it's not really getting the nutrients from anything outside other than the person that comes into this environment and gives it the nutrients that it needs. But the nutrients have to be emotional. They have to be under the surface. They can't be above the surface. There's a parable that Jesus told in the Bible about that, actually. The guy wanted to tear down a tree. The owner of the vineyard, I think it was a vineyard or whatever, and he's like, tear down the tree. And the vineyard worker was like, no, let's dig around the roots and give it some more time. And that's literally what the New Testament really is a mirror of, actually, is that the law or our performance, that we don't measure up. We don't measure up to this expectation. But why would that only increases our shame? And so Paul in the New Testament actually says the law increases sin, increases shame. But love draws us to repentance. if I'm loved, it's not about performance. It's I'm loved outside of performance, and that's the whole point of the gospel. You are loved even while you are in your sin. You don't have to, it's not about performance. But if you grow up in this home where you learn life is about performance, that's going to follow you into your faith or into your whatever, and you see whole denominations built off of that. But that's literally how the brain works, neurologically speaking. If I can come naked before somebody and be accepted outside of my performance, no matter what I've done, even the worst thing of the worst things ever, and if I can become vulnerable enough to where someone will embrace me, knowing what I've done, then I can know I'm loved, truly loved, because it's not about performance. That doesn't mean they respect me. It doesn't mean they trust me. It doesn't mean any of that. But I need to know that I'm loved or else I'm performing. So, does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense.
Yeah. And what's so interesting is in my field is that Gregory Beck, in the cognitive revolution, he moving away from Freud, which was more about feelings and mommy and daddy issues and stuff like that, was that basically came up with this idea that your thoughts control your feelings. And that's pretty much how the past few generations have been operating, and now we're seeing a huge, like almost a cultural shift from cultural narcissism to cultural bad, more of a cultural borderline idea, where I need everyone else to rescue me from feelings. Whereas this was your feelings don't matter. And you see the older generation saying that, generally speaking. And this swings back and forth, this integration, this global integration, it's cultural, that passed down genetically. So epigenetics are a predisposition towards a certain way of surviving. So bringing it back to your original thing, this apple tree in the desert drops, what seeds are going to germinate?
The ones that's been nourished the most.
Well, yes, except for since we're in a natural desert, it's because we're in a natural desert, the seeds that are more resistant to being able to not need as much water, those are more likely to germinate. That's adaptation. And then you get genetic isolation over time. You get these genes that literally, and this is what happens epigenetically. It's what's it called? Methylene. So you have these proteins, and how tightly they're wrapped will pass on information to your offspring, to the environment you're being born into. So then if you have like a certain emotionally triggered event, like why do we see certain substance abuse happen generationally? Why do we see, well, first off, the environment, nature and nurture happening together, the environment is toxic. It's like family dynamics, toxic family dynamics getting passed down. So you're gonna more likely to cope, but also your body is predispositioning you towards, as an offspring, you're being predispositioned towards the environment you're being born into. Does that make sense?
You're adapting.
Yes, except there's no major changes. It's just little markers, like switches that get turned on and off. And they get passed down that way. And so is it generational addiction? Yes, both nature and nurture. But ultimately, there is a way to resolve that whole thing, and it's attunement.
Is that kind of like why overseas, like in other countries, they can deal with the heat and such because they were born into it?
Yes.
Because they got like heat humidities of like 110, 115, stuff like that. But over here, we reach an index of 100, and we're like, oh my gosh, what's going on?
Yeah, you got generations of, Gregory Mendel stuff. Do you guys remember Gregory Mendel? Okay, so anyways, generations of basically people having more adapted people mating with more adaptive people. But there's no change, no species change in this. It's just literally just these markers being put on and then certain genes doing better in certain environments. So it's kind of, a couple things going on there. There was one other thing I wanted to say, but I don't remember. But do you guys have any other questions? Or any thoughts about this? Any challenges?
So when we talk about the synopsis because it seems to me.
Synapse, is that what you mean?
Yes, synapses.
Okay.
It seems to me it's still going to a cognitive type of thing where the human person of the tree is learning as it grows and
That's coping. I've learned how to cope with my environment versus actually healing. But keep going. I think that's what you're saying.
Yeah, because if in its own mind, if it doesn't know of the other tree, in its mind, that's how an apple tree looks.
Yep.
That is the apple tree.
I am an apple tree.
I am an apple tree. So I grow like this here. And when they see the other apple tree, to them, it may not seem like an apple tree because it's
That's exactly right.
completely different, you know? So, the question is this, does that apple tree that learned to grow like this, how would it respond in the environment where it's more nurtured with the wrapped,
Yeah.
the passed down, what's the word,
Epigenetics.
epigenetics, would that play a part in the seed that has now learned to grow without the water into a place where there's more nourishment?
Yes.
What happens then? Does the tree grow bigger, or is it a different tree?
Okay, so two things, and I'm going to try to remember both of them. One of them I want to say is, I'm going to bring it back to this, is if a hurricane hits, the same hurricane hits both of these trees. Think about me just saying that, and then think about me saying this. If a kid grows up in an unsafe environment, home, and they go through all these things, and they're basically become adults before they should be adults, we say in our culture, versus a kid who grows up in a super healthy environment. If I ask it that way, which one is more likely to be able to handle stress?
The one that was raised in an environment where it was not healthy.
Exactly, that's what we think. And we say kids are resilient, but that's not true at all. And it's completely observable, not true, neurologically speaking. You can directly correlate people's success in life into things that actually are successful based off of how safe their emotions were in their childhood, how well the attachment was. If a hurricane comes through, which one, in my story here, which one gets wrecked? The one with the thicker trunk or the one with the brittle trunk?
Of course, the bird tree
Right.
will fall.
So this is what's really going on neurologically. So the amount of bandwidth you have between your amygdala and prefrontal directly depends on what goes on down here. If you don't have that, you are operating from performance. Now, the moment that your performance doesn't measure up, you try to squeeze out to look like this tree, or you try to measure up, you're going to relapse. Once the stimulus becomes more overwhelming than your capacity to manage emotions, there's a difference. You don't even have to manage the emotions over here. Like, you feel them, but there's nothing to manage because but if you grew up over here and this is all you know, bringing it back to your question, and then you suddenly end up over here, there's a couple things that happen. So interestingly, in the Bible, it says these things get passed down up to 7 generations. And I think what we found is like 14 generations scientifically. So yes, you will have certain information that will be likely passed on. Now, there are changes, switches that get turned off. We talk about with the proteins and the methylation, I think is the word, that happen. But until you're in this environment, you don't even know what it's like. It's like living, like, what is it? Was it Socrates that talked about the cave? It's like you're in the, I don't remember who, Plato? Okay, so like once I'm outside of the cave, I can see, but when I was inside the cave, I thought I was outside of the cave kind of situation. I didn't even know there was an outside of the cave. And when people told me about it, it didn't really make sense. It's like, oh yeah, I feel my emotions, but it's completely different. Like once you come over here, there will be residual stuff, but each trauma, each emotional need that you have in a neurological subset in your brain, there's certain things registered around your amygdala that if you heal one of them through memory consolidation, which I was trying to explain before, you still have other things that are trauma-based in your life. The only difference is when the first time you feel really heard and seen emotionally, you internalize self-worth, which then means I don't need necessarily the same coping skills, but I might have other traumas that still need to be addressed. If I don't address those traumas, they're going to follow me over here, but I'm not really over here if I still have those traumas.
So you're saying the seed from the bitter tree in the
Let's just say humans.
Environment may not grow as strong as a tree that's always been in that environment.
So you're already growing. Like, what age are we talking person-wise? Because that makes a difference. You know, if it's a child you pull into this environment versus an adult.
Well, I was meaning child seed, because we was talking about the
Okay, so if someone is adopted,
yeah.
Is that the context?
Okay, let's say that, yeah.
Okay, so if someone is adopted, yes, you have the epigenetic factors here, but then you also already coming into a situation where you are going to ask, if you don't have the right emotional support, why wasn't I loved by my family? Why was I abandoned? Why wasn't I enough? I'm internalizing my worth based off of my abandonment. And if I don't have the emotional support to be validated through empathetic attunement, what am I going to do with that?
So the first 3 years are still there.
Yeah, I mean, yeah,
Sorry,
totally.
yeah.
You could be a baby, and but then depending on the environment you're planted in, directly correlates to how well you're going to handle and process those things. But the epigenetic things do happen, but you can turn these things on and off. The tightening and loosening of the methylenes, as I understand it.
So it takes extra empathy to, like the PlayStation controller, to switch on and off those thoughts, those emotional traumas that comes from the epigenetics.
Actual empathy, I would say.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
so the adopted child can be loved enough to where those things are switched, that those things that need to be switched off are switched off, so that the next generation that this adopted child nurtures has the right equipment to be the well-developed tree.
So all of us come from codependent. I don't know anybody who's not codependent in some way. All right, all of us are operating from survival adaptations that have been passed down. All of us are. Like, I don't know I've never met a single person that does attunement outside of training naturally. But once you experience it and you see it under a neuroscan, you can see that this is 100% how our brains were developed, but generationally somewhere along the way we lost it. So everybody fits into your story in some level of a spectrum, first off. You get what I'm saying? Like, all of us are as we heal and we get these things experienced, I honestly, I don't know if like it's even possible to hit every single thing unless somebody's constantly in therapy or just lucks up and hits the person that grew up in a perfect environment. I think we're always going to be carrying some things, but until we start moving this way and we create this environment for others and for our kids and stuff like that, we're just perpetuating more of it, more brokenness. You know what I'm saying? So, does that answer the question? No? Yeah? Thank you for speaking up, because usually I have a lot more interaction. It helps me describe it. Yeah, if there's no other questions, I don't know what else I would even say right now.